May 24, 1940, northern France, near the canal lines north of the river Ardennes. From a modest rise overlooking the flat terrain, Major General Heinz Guderian surveyed the landscape through his binoculars. In the distance, roughly 12 miles away, he could make out the unmistakable outlines of Dunkirk, its ancient fortifications and church towers faintly visible through the mist of the morning air. What lay before him was a sight few German commanders had ever imagined they would witness so soon. His 18th Panzer Corps, the armored vanguard of Germany's western offensive, was positioned for what appeared to be the final decisive action of the campaign. The British Expeditionary Force, along with large elements of French and Belgian units, had been driven into a narrow coastal pocket. Escape seemed improbable. From a purely military standpoint, the destruction of this force appeared imminent, and with it, the possible collapse of organized resistance in Western Europe. Then, without warning, a directive arrived from higher command. All forward movement was to stop. Armored units were forbidden from crossing the canal. The advance was suspended indefinitely. Guderian later wrote that the order left him stunned. In his memoir Panzer Leader, he would describe this decision as one of the most damaging interventions of the entire war, a moment that altered events far beyond the battlefield in front of him. What had seemed like the culmination of an unprecedented operational triumph was abruptly frozen in place. Behind Guderian's forces lay a succession of astonishing achievements. German armor had smashed through Allied defenses at Sedan, crossed the Meuse, and surged westward with breathtaking speed. In little more than a week, panzer columns had reached the English Channel, an advance once considered logistically reckless, if not impossible. The Allied armies had been cut off from the south, severed from reinforcement and retreat. Ahead of the German lines now stood nearly 400,000 enemy soldiers pressed against the sea, confined to a shrinking perimeter. Militarily, the situation favored Germany overwhelmingly. Yet at precisely this decisive juncture, the momentum of the campaign stalled. This pause would echo through history. From the German perspective, Dunkirk was not initially viewed as a miraculous Allied escape, but as a victory left unfinished. Soldiers and officers alike watched with growing frustration as naval vessels, both military and civilian, began ferrying trapped troops across the Channel. Units that German commanders believed had already been defeated were slipping away under their eyes. Tank officers who had spent days driving at full speed, ignoring exhaustion and mechanical strain, were now ordered to hold position. Veterans would later recall the sense of disbelief as they observed an enemy evacuation proceeding virtually unchallenged. In the decades after the war, many German participants would return to this episode, questioning how events might have unfolded had the advance not been halted. To understand how this moment came about, one must look back to the opening of the campaign itself. On May 10, 1940, German forces launched Fall Gelb Case Yellow, the offensive against the Low Countries and France. The operation represented the practical application of a radical new approach to warfare, emphasizing speed, concentration of armor, and deep penetration rather than static front lines. Army Group A, commanded by General Oberst Gerd von Rundstedt, was assigned the main striking role. Under his authority operated the 4th Army led by General Gunther von Gruge, the 12th Army under Wilhelm List, and the 16th Army commanded by Ernst Busch. However, the most decisive element of Rundstedt's command was Panzer Group Kleist, which concentrated the bulk of Germany's armored divisions. The strategic concept, originally developed by General Erich von Manstein and ultimately endorsed by Adolf Hitler, deliberately defied Allied expectations. While Army Group B under Fedor von Bock advanced into Belgium and the Netherlands, creating the illusion of a repeat of the 1914 Schlieffen maneuver, the true Schwerpunkt or main effort lay elsewhere. German armored forces were funneled through the dense and rugged Ardennes forest, a region the Allies had judged unsuitable for large-scale mechanized operations. It was here that Guderian's 9th Panzer Corps would prove them wrong. Under Guderian's command were 3 formidable divisions. The 1st Panzer Division was led by General Friedrich Kirchner, the 2nd Panzer Division by Rudolf Weil, and the 10th Panzer Division by Ferdinand Schall. Together, these units spearheaded the breakthrough that shattered French defenses and set the conditions for the dramatic encirclement that followed. By the time Guderian stood overlooking Dunkirk in late May, the German army had achieved what few thought possible in modern warfare. Yet the order to halt, issued at the very edge of total victory, ensured that Dunkirk would not be remembered by Germans as a triumph, but as a defining moment of hesitation. A moment when history paused, and the future of the war quietly changed direction. Alongside the advance of General Heinz Guderian's infantry formations, another powerful armored force was moving with equal determination. General Hermann Hoth's forward with two additional units, the 5th Panzer Division and the 7th Panzer Division. The latter was led by an energetic and highly driven commander, General Erwin Rommel. Within a short time, Rommel's unit would become famous under a new name, the Ghost Division, a title earned for its uncanny ability to appear in unexpected locations, often far ahead of friendly forces. The German breakthrough unfolded at a pace that stunned both allies and adversaries. By May 13, Guderian's troops had forced a crossing of the Meuse River at Sedan. This success followed an overwhelming aerial assault carried out by Luftwaffe units, particularly Fliegerkorps T under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen, a relative of the famed First World War ace known as the Red Baron. The intensity of the bombing shattered French defensive positions, leaving them unable to withstand the coordinated assault that followed. Tanks, motorized infantry and dive bombers struck in rapid succession, overwhelming resistance before it could properly reorganize. Speed was the defining feature of the German advance. Hans von Luck, who served as a reconnaissance battalion commander in Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, later reflected on these events in his memoir Panzer Commander. He recalled that his unit reached the Meuse in only 3 days, a rate of movement so fast that even German planners had not anticipated it. This remarkable tempo was not achieved through armor alone. It was the result of a fundamentally new method of warfare. Luftwaffe liaison officers were embedded with forward units and equipped with radios, allowing them to request close air support almost instantly. Within roughly 45 minutes, Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers could be dispatched to strike enemy positions. Aircraft from formations such as Sturzkampfgeschwader 2 and Sti-77 descended with their sirens howling, a sound deliberately designed to terrorize troops on the ground. Long before German tanks arrived, enemy morale was often already broken. The campaign demonstrated how psychological pressure could be fused with mechanical efficiency. By May 20, German armored columns from the 2nd Panzer Division reached the coastal town of Noyelles-sur-Mer on the English Channel. In just 10 days, German forces had carved a narrow but decisive corridor from the Ardennes to the sea, effectively splitting Allied armies in northern France and Belgium into isolated groups. The speed and scale of this achievement were so extraordinary that Adolf Hitler himself reportedly reacted with disbelief when informed of the situation. Yet rapid success came at a cost. Continuous movement took a heavy toll on the panzer units, mechanical failures increased, combat losses accumulated, and spare parts were in short supply. By May 21, several armored formations reported that barely half of their original tanks remained operational. Supply columns were stretched across vast distances, and foot infantry struggled to keep up with the fast-moving spearheads, leaving armored units increasingly exposed. That vulnerability became clear on May 21 near the town of Arras. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, advancing aggressively, was suddenly struck by a counterattack launched by British armored forces. The encounter caught the Germans off guard. According to Rommel's own war diary, the division suffered 89 soldiers killed, 116 wounded, and 173 missing, losses greater than those sustained during the entire breakthrough phase of the campaign. Rommel personally intervened, directing anti-tank guns himself. In later reports, he emphasized that he personally assigned targets to each gun crew in the heat of battle. Although the British attack was eventually repelled, its psychological impact was significant. German high command, particularly at General von Kleist's headquarters, grew increasingly uneasy. The engagement at Arras had demonstrated that Allied forces still possessed the ability to launch sharp and dangerous counterblows. Concerns mounted over the exposed flanks of the panzer divisions and the risk of advancing too far ahead of supporting forces. By May 23, German troops had captured Boulogne and were pressing hard against Calais. Meanwhile, the British Expeditionary Force, the French First Army, and remaining Belgian units were compressed into an ever-tightening pocket along the coast with the sea at their backs. Confidence at German headquarters was high. Wehrmacht communications staff began preparing announcements celebrating what they believed would be the greatest encirclement and destruction of enemy forces in military history. That same evening, however, a critical decision was made. General Oberst Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, reviewed reports from his Panzer commanders. They described declining tank strength, exhausted crews, stretched supply routes, and the warning sign delivered at Arras. Weighing these factors, Rundstedt issued an initial order to slow and temporarily halt the armored advance. The following morning, May 24, 1940, Adolf Hitler arrived at Rundstedt's headquarters near Charleville-Mézières. According to the diary of Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, the decisive order was formally transmitted at 12:42 p.m. That command to halt the panzers would become one of the most debated and consequential decisions of the entire Second World War. By directive from the Führer, the German advance northwest of Arras was ordered to stop along a broad line running through Lens, Béthune, and the outskirts of Gravelines. The armored spearheads were explicitly forbidden from crossing the canal system ahead of them. To commanders at the front, the decision was baffling and deeply frustrating. Hitler's hesitation stemmed from several overlapping concerns. Field Marshal von Rundstedt feared that the rapidly advancing panzer units had exposed flanks and believed the infantry needed time to close the gap. Hitler himself remained psychologically scarred by his experiences in the muddy killing fields of Flanders during the First World War and viewed the low, marshy ground around Dunkirk as dangerous terrain for tanks. He was unwilling to gamble Germany's prized armored formations in what he perceived as a potential trap. Yet the most influential intervention came not from the battlefield but over the telephone. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and Reichsmarschall of the Third Reich, assured Hitler that air power alone could annihilate the trapped Allied forces. According to Göring, there was no need to risk valuable panzers when German bombers and fighters could crush the enemy from the sky. This promise would prove to be one of the most consequential misjudgments of the entire campaign. The halt order took effect immediately. General Heinz Guderian, commanding the 2IX Panzer Corps and already within visual range of Dunkirk, reacted with rage. His units had momentum. Bridging equipment from the 1st Panzer Division had already been deployed across the AI Canal, and reconnaissance elements had pushed beyond it. Now, despite being poised for a decisive breakthrough, the armored units were ordered to withdraw, dig in, and adopt defensive postures. For 3 critical days, German forces remained largely inactive while history unfolded before them. From observation points and through binoculars, soldiers watched the sea fill with vessels of every conceivable type. British destroyers arrived first, followed by ferries, merchant ships, fishing trawlers, and private pleasure boats, anything capable of carrying men across the channel. The evacuation was beginning in plain sight. Contemporary German unit diaries reveal widespread irritation and disbelief. Engineers from the 2nd Panzer Division spent May 25 constructing bridges across the canal network, fully expecting that the order to advance would soon be restored. Artillery batteries continued intermittent shelling of Dunkirk's port facilities and beaches, but the Wehrmacht's most potent weapon, its concentrated armored force, remained unused. Only on the evening of May 26 did Hitler finally revoke the halt order. Even then, the delay continued. It took another 16 hours for formations to reorganize and resume movement. By that time, the Allies had gained nearly 4 invaluable days to fortify defensive lines and implement Operation Dynamo in earnest. When German units finally pushed forward on May 27, they encountered something entirely different from what they had anticipated. Instead of panic and disorder, they faced structured resistance. Göring's confident assurances that the Luftwaffe would eliminate the Dunkirk pocket now faced a harsh test. On paper, German air strength was formidable. Luftflotte 2, commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, and Luftflotte 3 under Hugo Sperl were supported by Fliegerkorps 8, led by Wolfram von Richthofen and equipped with Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. In total, the Germans committed more than 300 bombers and approximately 550 fighter aircraft to the operation. May 27 marked the first full day of Operation Dynamo and the Luftwaffe's concentrated effort to fulfill Göring's promise. From early morning until nightfall, German aircraft struck Dunkirk and its surroundings in relentless waves. Fires engulfed the harbour, and burning oil tanks sent towering columns of black smoke into the sky, visible from miles away. Despite the devastation, German war diaries, particularly those of Fliegerkorps II, recorded an unexpected challenge, determined resistance from the Royal Air Force. Spitfires and Hurricanes flying from bases in southern England intercepted German formations repeatedly. On that first day alone, the Luftwaffe lost 23 aircraft, including veteran crews whose experience could not be easily replaced. A key limitation soon became clear range. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E fighters, operating from airfields in Belgium, had barely 10 minutes of combat time over Dunkirk before fuel constraints forced them to disengage. Once the escorts departed, the Stuka dive bombers, so effective under protection, became dangerously exposed to modern Allied fighters. Nature further complicated matters. Weather conditions over the evacuation zone were frequently poor. Of the 9 days that Operation Dynamo lasted, only 2.5 offered conditions suitable for sustained air operations. In the end, Göring's confidence proved disastrously misplaced. The Luftwaffe failed to destroy the Allied forces at Dunkirk, and the pause imposed on the German army allowed one of the most remarkable evacuations in military history to succeed, transforming what should have been a catastrophic defeat. On May 2008, operations were severely hampered as smoke from burning oil and persistent cloud cover obscured German observation and bombing targets. Kessler raised concerns with Göring, pointing out that Luftwaffe crews were nearing exhaustion after 2 continuous weeks of intensive sorties. The Luftwaffe's most effective day came on June 1, when clear skies allowed for an uninterrupted offensive. On that day, German forces sank 4 British destroyers along with several smaller vessels. However, by this point, the majority of the British Expeditionary Force had already been successfully evacuated across the Channel. Throughout the evacuation, the Luftwaffe flew a total of 1,882 bombing missions and 1,997 fighter sorties, yet these efforts failed to halt the withdrawal. Among German pilots, Joachim Mundberg of Jagdgeschwader 26 conducted numerous escort operations over the evacuating forces. His combat records claim 5 Spitfires destroyed, including an impressive 4 in a single day on May 30, which earned him the Iron Cross, First Class. Despite these achievements, Mundberg's reports emphasize the high level of British resistance and the operational difficulties encountered when flying at extended range. When German ground troops renewed their offensive on May 27, they met a drastically altered defensive landscape. The British had utilized the respite afforded by prior operations to construct a strong defensive line along the canal systems. French units, particularly elements of the First Army, mounted a determined final defense that tied down German divisions that were urgently needed on other fronts. According to the 18th Corps War Diary, the German 56th Infantry Division attempted to advance through flooded terrain toward the Dunkirk perimeter, only to sustain heavy losses against well-prepared British positions. The division was rendered combat ineffective and subsequently had to be pulled back. Robert Kershaw in Dunkirk 1940 notes that there was almost no coherent plan for systematically reducing the pocket. German units attacked in a piecemeal fashion, lacking coordination and concentrated effort. Flooding further restricted German operations, with only half of the 10 divisions encircling Dunkirk able to maneuver effectively on solid ground. The siege of Lille proved especially costly. Over 4 days, 7 German divisions engaged approximately 40,000 French defenders. While the French garrison ultimately surrendered on May 30, their staunch defense delayed German reinforcements that might otherwise have influenced the Dunkirk operation. General Wagner, commander of the German forces at Lille, later observed that the French resistance had exceeded all expectations. German artillery observers documented striking scenes along the beaches. Wehrmacht records describe long, disciplined columns of soldiers stretching from the dunes into the sea, maintaining order even under bombardment. The diversity of vessels involved in the evacuation also drew attention. Observers noted a wide array of ships ranging from Royal Navy destroyers and commercial steamers to fishing trawlers and privately owned yachts. A divisional war diary commented on the remarkable discipline maintained by the British and French forces during the evacuation, underscoring the efficiency and organization of what was one of the most complex maritime evacuations in history. Small civilian vessels tirelessly ferried troops between the shore and the larger naval ships, effectively bypassing German artillery assaults. The sudden and widespread participation of private boats in the evacuation caught German commanders entirely off guard. General Ritter von Thoma, whose armored divisions were immobilized by conflicting orders and challenging terrain, later recounted observing Dunkirk through binoculars, witnessing British rearguard units executing methodical and highly disciplined fighting withdrawals. The efficiency and composure of these retreating forces directly contradicted Nazi propaganda portraying democratic armies as disorganized and ineffectual. Letters from German soldiers preserved in the Bundesarchiv reflect a spectrum of reactions to the Dunkirk operation. Initial confidence in a rapid British surrender gradually shifted to doubt as resistance continued. The sheer quantity of abandoned material, 2,472 artillery pieces, 84,427 vehicles, and 657,566 tons of supplies, according to Wehrmacht records, seemed to confirm the destruction of the British Expeditionary Force as a combat entity. Yet intelligence reports indicated growing unease among German units. Observing a supposedly defeated army escape with such success raised questions about what fully prepared defenders might achieve in future conflicts. Units that had endured heavier than expected casualties against the British rearguards felt this psychological strain particularly acutely. Incidents of undisciplined violence, such as the SS Totenkopf Division's killings of British prisoners at Le Paradis on May 27 and at Wormhout on May 28, underscored the impact of unexpectedly stiff resistance on poorly trained formations. These actions, documented in post-war trials, provide insight into the extreme stress German troops experienced during the evacuation. Secret recordings of German communications, analyzed by Sönke Nitel using British intelligence sources, further demonstrate the profound effect Dunkirk had on German military thinking. Veterans often refer to it as a lost opportunity that, if seized, might have decisively ended the conflict. Post-war assessments by German military analysts identified Dunkirk as the critical point where strategic initiative began to slip from Germany's grasp. While further victories were still possible, the chance for a rapid conclusion to the war had vanished, and all subsequent operations would face active British opposition. Field Marshal Franz Halder's diary offers one of the most detailed contemporary critiques of Hitler's HALT order. In his entry from May 24, Halder described Hitler as anxious and excessively cautious, unwilling to take risks. Halder opposed the pause, arguing that the Luftwaffe's effectiveness depended heavily on favorable weather conditions. In his post-war memoir, Heinz Guderian, commander of the Panzer units, portrayed the HALT as a turning point with severe consequences, reflecting his professional frustration. His armored divisions had approached striking distance of Dunkirk when operations were suspended. General Rundstedt initially justified the HALT due to overextended flanks and tank losses, but later post-war accounts attributed the decision entirely to Hitler, a narrative unsupported by primary documents yet widely propagated. Meanwhile, Hermann Göring never acknowledged miscalculations publicly, but the Luftwaffe's shortcomings during the evacuation irreversibly damaged his credibility. Internal evaluations of Luftwaffe operations revealed systemic limitations, restricted operational range, heavy reliance on suitable weather, and the unexpectedly effective performance of the RAF. After-action reports from commanders Kessler and Richthofen emphasized that their forces were exhausted after 2 weeks of continuous operations. Aircraft losses during the Dunkirk operation ranged between 156 and 240, depleting assets that would later be critical in the Battle of Britain. While most attention centered on the beaches of Dunkirk, approximately 40,000 French soldiers mounted a remarkable defensive effort at Lee. Over 4 days, they held 7 German divisions, including 3 armored formations, demonstrating extraordinary resilience. German unit records express a grudging admiration for the French forces' determination, acknowledging the unexpectedly high cost of their advance. General Wagner's forces encountered unexpectedly heavy losses during street-to-street fighting for which their preparation had been insufficient. When the garrison ultimately capitulated on May 30, German troops performed formal military honors, a rare acknowledgement indicative of genuine respect for the defenders. Churchill later estimated that the French resistance at Lille allowed for the evacuation of an additional 100,000 troops. German intelligence expressed mounting frustration over the French defensive measures encircling Dunkirk. By skillfully using controlled flooding, French units transformed key access routes into lethal obstacles for the attackers. The 68th Infantry Division successfully repelled repeated German assaults while evacuation operations were ongoing. Reports from Wehrmacht highlighted that French units preserved cohesion and discipline even after Belgium's surrender on May 28 exposed their flank. German commanders had anticipated a collapse in morale but instead encountered heightened resolve among the defenders. Following June 4, German forces entering Dunkirk discovered staggering amounts of abandoned military materiel. Quartermasters recorded a cache that included 2,472 artillery pieces, 84,427 vehicles, and 657,566 tons of ammunition and supplies. Propaganda units produced extensive footage of the captured equipment, creating an impression of a decisive German victory. This windfall, however, contributed to a fundamental misjudgment. German leadership assumed that Britain had been effectively disarmed, which shaped Operation Sea Lion planning and led to an underestimation of British capacity for continued resistance. By May 24, German armoured divisions had suffered significant attrition due to combat losses and mechanical failures. Tanks from Panzer III and Panzer IV units proved far less reliable than anticipated during prolonged operations, with some formations reporting only half their vehicles operational. This technical limitation heavily influenced the decision to halt the advance. Even with full situational awareness of the remaining French forces, preserving armoured strength became a strategic priority. Each tank lost at Dunkirk would be unavailable for the impending push toward Paris. German intelligence had estimated that no more than 45,000 Allied troops might escape via the sea. The actual evacuation of over 330,000 soldiers vastly exceeded these projections. German doctrine, which emphasized encirclement battles where trapped forces typically surrendered, had not accounted for large-scale maritime extraction. The sudden mobilization of civilian vessels, the so-called little ships, was completely unforeseen. High Command fundamentally misunderstood the broader consequences of Dunkirk. On June 5, Hitler publicly declared the British Expeditionary Force destroyed. The abundance of abandoned equipment appeared to confirm this assessment. Consequently, German planning for an invasion of Britain assumed they would confront demoralized, poorly supplied forces. Instead, the troops that escaped became a seasoned nucleus around which Britain would rapidly rebuild its army. The morale boost and public resolve, later termed the Dunkirk spirit, proved far more significant than German calculations had predicted. The directive to halt the German advance originated at Hitler's headquarters in Felsen, near Bad Münstereifel. Staff officers later described Hitler's mood as fluctuating. Initial exhilaration at the rapid breakthrough gave way to mounting anxiety as armored units surged ahead. Halder documented Hitler's fear that the swift success might conceal an unseen trap, a paranoia shaped by his First World War experiences. The resulting halt order was issued personally by Hitler to frontline units, bypassing standard military command channels, a decision that would have lasting operational consequences. During the evacuation, German headquarters received increasingly urgent reports about the mass withdrawal of Allied forces. Despite the mounting evidence, Hitler remained surprisingly unconcerned, firmly believing that Britain would soon negotiate for peace. This misjudgment of the situation would later prove disastrous for Germany's strategic goals. Joseph Goebbels was tasked with framing the retreat of hundreds of thousands of soldiers as a triumph. German media highlighted territorial gains and captured equipment, downplaying the significance of the large-scale Allied escape. Newspapers such as the Völkischer Beobachter described the campaign as an unprecedentedly decisive battle, presenting an illusion of total victory. Wehrmacht communications reinforced this narrative. A June 5 bulletin emphasized the number of prisoners taken and equipment seized while deliberately omitting the scale of the evacuation. As a result, official propaganda diverged sharply from the realities observed by soldiers at the front. Initially, the German public remained largely unaware of how many Allied troops had successfully withdrawn. However, soldiers returning on leave gradually began to share first-hand accounts, prompting growing unease about the continuation of the conflict against Britain. Reports from the secret police in the summer of 1940 indicate increasing concern among civilians regarding the feasibility of defeating Britain. The Luftwaffe's later failure in the Battle of Britain, coupled with the abandonment of Operation Sea Lion, confirmed widespread suspicions that Germany had missed a critical opportunity at Dunkirk. The inability to annihilate the British Expeditionary Force (BEF) forced a re-evaluation of German invasion plans. Planners for Operation Sea Lion now had to consider that hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers remained free rather than captured as initially expected. Admiral Raeder argued that if Britain could evacuate its forces under constant bombardment, defending against an invasion would be equally feasible. The Luftwaffe's shortcomings at Dunkirk cast serious doubt on Germany's ability to achieve the air superiority deemed essential for a successful cross-channel assault. Post-Dunkirk analyses by the Wehrmacht identified several vulnerabilities exposed during the campaign. The British demonstrated remarkable capacity to mobilize civilian resources, mount persistent defensive operations, and leverage naval dominance. These insights heavily influenced the eventual decision to cancel Operation Sea Lion. The larger strategic consequence of Dunkirk was profound. Germany remained locked in a war with Britain, ensuring that a prolonged conflict with eventual US involvement and sustained pressure from the Western Allies would be inevitable, even while engaging the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Throughout the war, German military strategists revisited the Dunkirk episode, recognizing it as a turning point where operational momentum shifted irreversibly. Every campaign afterward faced coordinated British resistance, and Britain served as the hub for Allied coalition building and eventual invasion planning. In the field, the impact of the evacuation was keenly felt. Hans von Luck's reconnaissance battalion of the 7th Panzer Division spearheaded the rapid advance through Belgium, reaching the Meuse River in just 3 days. In his memoirs, Panzer Commander von Luck expressed frustration at being ordered to halt while vast numbers of enemy troops escaped. "We could not comprehend why such a large portion of the enemy was allowed to slip away," he recalled. Reconnaissance units, trained to exploit breakthroughs, remained idle as the evacuation proceeded. Even within the professional soldier, there was recognition of a strategic failure, despite the official narrative claiming victory. The after-action report of the 7th Panzer Division, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, recounts near disaster on May 20 honest, when British Matilda tanks breached the division's flank. Von Luck personally coordinated 88mm anti-tank guns in a direct ground deployment to stabilize the front. The psychological effect on German commanders was substantial. If just 2 British battalions could cause such disruption, what might a fully organized counteroffensive achieve? This uncertainty contributed to the caution reflected in HALT orders. Wehrmacht artillery observers recorded the evacuation in detail, noting the orderly conduct of troops on the beaches. Unit diaries described scenes akin to a bustling ant colony, with long queues maintaining discipline under fire. The diversity of vessels from warships to civilian pleasure boats illustrated the improvisational capacity of the British, a factor that had not been anticipated by German planners. In summary, Dunkirk revealed critical flaws in German assumptions about the Allied forces' vulnerability, reshaped invasion planning, and ensured Britain remained a formidable adversary. The evacuation not only preserved a significant portion of the BEF, but also laid the groundwork for sustained Allied resistance and coalition building, ultimately altering the course of the war in Europe. Records from Luftwaffe units illustrate the operational difficulties encountered during the Dunkirk evacuation. The War Diary of JG-26 highlights the immense strain imposed by long-range sorties. Pilots often had only a brief window over their targets before fuel limitations forced a return to base. Stuka units reported severe casualties, particularly when fighter escorts withdrew prematurely. Meteorological observations from Luftflotte 2 and 3 indicate that adverse weather prevailed for the majority of the evacuation, while thick smoke from burning fuel storage further complicated targeting. General Kessler's repeated complaints to Hermann Göring regarding pilot fatigue were largely ignored. Meanwhile, Joachim Munberg of JG-26 achieved notable aerial successes, claiming multiple Spitfires, yet his combat logs reveal the unexpectedly fierce resistance of the Royal Air Force. British fighter formations consistently outnumbered what German intelligence had predicted, complicating Luftwaffe operations. On June 1, the Luftwaffe's concentrated efforts succeeded in sinking several vessels, but the timing was too late. Most Allied forces had already been withdrawn. Despite flying nearly 4,000 sorties, the Luftwaffe fell short of fulfilling Göring's ambitious promises. Post-war interviews with German veterans frequently identified Dunkirk as a pivotal moment in the war. Former Wehrmacht officers, when debriefed by the US Army's Historical Division, described it as the point at which victory began to slip from their grasp. General Ritter von Thoma, speaking to historian Basil Liddell-Hart, recalled observing the operation firsthand near Bruges, noting his enduring frustration at being restrained from advancing. Historians have long examined the decision to halt the German advance. Official German histories cite multiple contributing factors: tank attrition, extended supply lines, Hitler's caution, and Göring's reassurances about air superiority. Contemporary scholarship further emphasizes that the HALT order was only one element. French resistance, British resolve, and German operational fatigue collectively shaped the outcome. The Dunkirk episode had lasting consequences for German military thinking. The inability to prevent a large-scale maritime evacuation led to heightened attention on coastal defense and anti-shipping strategies. Nevertheless, these lessons were implemented too late to influence the overall trajectory of the war. Wehrmacht analyses from 1941 to 1945 repeatedly referred to Dunkirk as a cautionary example of the hazards of an incomplete victory. The successful withdrawal of defeated forces challenged German doctrines emphasizing decisive engagements and total annihilation of enemy armies. The human cost of the French campaign was significant. German forces sustained between 120,000 and 160,000 casualties, a relatively modest toll considering the scale of their victories, though Dunkirk itself accounted for notable losses. Evacuation statistics underscore the strategic impact. 338,226 British soldiers were rescued, alongside 139,997 French and Belgian troops. Approximately 40,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Luftwaffe aircraft losses ranged from 156 to 240, and while captured German materiel was minimal, the Germans forfeited a subtle but meaningful tactical edge. Dunkirk represents a paradoxical outcome, a clear tactical success for the Wehrmacht with profound strategic consequences that would haunt the German war effort. Analyses of the HALT order highlight a complex interplay of factors: mechanical limitations, supply challenges, cautious command decisions, inter-service competition, and underestimation of the adversary. In post-war German military education, Dunkirk became a central case study, illustrating how incomplete victories can transform operational triumph into eventual strategic failure. The Wehrmacht's own reviews concluded that political interference, rivalry among branches, and failure to comprehend enemy psychology were key elements that turned apparent success into a missed opportunity. From the perspective of German military leadership, the events at Dunkirk represent one of the most paradoxical outcomes in modern warfare. What unfolded was a scenario where extraordinary tactical achievement directly led to a strategic vulnerability. The Wehrmacht executed their campaign with remarkable efficiency. Within a matter of weeks, they broke through Allied defenses, encircled vast forces, and drove them to the Channel coast. They dismantled armies, seized large swathes of territory, and appeared poised to bring the Western Front to a decisive close. Yet, despite these accomplishments, hesitation at the command level, rivalries among branches, and a fundamental underestimation of Allied determination allowed a crucial portion of the enemy forces to slip away. The orders issued between May 24th and 26th, 1940, halting the German advance, proved to be a decision of immense historical consequence. Had the armored divisions pressed forward without interruption, had German commanders been granted the freedom to complete the encirclement, or had the Luftwaffe decisively neutralized the retreating forces, the trajectory of the Second World War might have shifted dramatically. Britain, stripped of much of its professional army, could have faced coercion into negotiation. The United States might have lacked a viable entry point into the European theater, and the Soviet Union might have confronted Germany in isolation, with potentially devastating implications for global history. Instead, Dunkirk emerged as a turning point where German territorial gains reached a ceiling, signaling the beginning of a prolonged strategic decline. For the German soldiers observing the evacuation, the moment was not fully understood. They witnessed Allied forces withdrawing under immense pressure, saw abandoned equipment along the beaches, and noted their own military superiority. However, they could not anticipate that this rapid operational triumph would be overshadowed by the survival of the enemy, who would later return to play a pivotal role in turning the tide of the war. In essence, the Germans achieved remarkable battlefield victories while simultaneously sowing the seeds of their future strategic defeats, a textbook example of a hollow success. German records, including field diaries, after-action reports, and post-war reflections, highlight the tension between operational brilliance and strategic oversight. The Wehrmacht excelled in maneuver warfare and coordination, yet failed to integrate political awareness into their military calculations. They dominated battles, yet could not convert these victories into lasting strategic advantage. In the eyes of the German troops encircling Dunkirk, the immediate signs were clear. The enemy was in retreat, German forces were dominant, and victory seemed near. Yet the larger implications, how the escape of thousands of Allied soldiers would shape the conflict over the coming years, remained entirely invisible to them. Dunkirk thus stands as a striking illustration of the duality of war. It was simultaneously an apex of German military prowess and a moment of strategic misjudgment. The beaches that had symbolized imminent victory transformed into a testament to opportunity lost. The soldiers who watched the evacuation could not grasp that the very forces they allowed to escape would later return as liberators and conquerors, reshaping Europe. The German perspective underscores a broader lesson. Success in immediate engagements does not automatically translate into long-term advantage, and without strategic foresight, even flawless execution on the battlefield can yield disastrous consequences. Today, with the final witnesses gone, historical records offer a window into this complexity. Dunkirk reminds us that victory and defeat are rarely straightforward. Tactical dominance can coexist with strategic failure, and the moral and political dimensions of conflict often outweigh the immediate gains of military action. From this vantage, the German experience at Dunkirk serves as a cautionary study in the limits of battlefield success when unaccompanied by comprehensive strategic vision. The calamity for Germany at Dunkirk was not rooted in battlefield failure. By conventional military standards, the German forces had executed a flawless campaign. Their operational success was near total. Entire Allied formations were encircled, equipment seized, and positions overrun. Yet the deeper misstep lay in the strategic dimension. War is not only about defeating an opponent on the field, but also about breaking their determination to continue fighting. At Dunkirk, while German troops dismantled Allied materiel, they inadvertently strengthened the resolve of a nation determined to endure. The evacuation of British and Allied forces, observed by German soldiers with mounting irritation, became the cornerstone of sustained British resistance, the foundation for a strengthened transatlantic alliance, and eventually a pivotal springboard for Germany's own liberation. Dunkirk thus represents a paradoxical moment, the height of operational brilliance coupled with the inception of a strategic downturn. Commanders who hesitated along the canals, Luftwaffe pilots who failed to halt the evacuation, and infantry units witnessing empty beaches were, often unknowingly, participants in one of the decisive turning points of the conflict. In tactical terms, the Germans had achieved almost everything, yet they had failed in the aspect that mattered most, preventing the Allies from regrouping and turning the tide of war. From a German perspective, Dunkirk is a study in the limits of military triumph. A technically perfect operation ended in strategic miscalculation. A battlefield victory ensured long-term setbacks. Moments of apparent success masked the seeds of future calamity. German testimonies preserved in archives reveal a shared frustration and a recognition of lost opportunity. The chance to conclude the war rapidly, to prevent a protracted conflict that would engulf both Germany and the European continent. The soldiers who observed the evacuation left behind more than abandoned equipment and empty beaches. They left the single most promising opportunity for a swift, decisive victory. Their recollections underscore an enduring lesson in military history. Victory on the battlefield does not automatically translate into strategic dominance. The consequences of command decisions extend far beyond immediate tactical results, shaping the course of nations and conflicts for years to come. Those German soldiers at Dunkirk occupy a unique place in history. They were victors who inadvertently enabled their own future defeat, conquerors who facilitated their own vulnerability, witnesses to the collision of tactical genius and strategic blindness. Acknowledging their experience is not a matter of glorifying German military capability or excusing Nazi aggression, but rather of appreciating the intricate realities of warfare. Dunkirk illustrates how seemingly complete success can harbor the beginnings of disaster, how military achievements devoid of political foresight may prove hollow, and how understanding history demands attention to multiple perspectives. The sands of Dunkirk, once watched by frustrated German forces, stand as a silent testament to the complexities and contradictions of war. For Britain, they symbolize resilience and survival. For France, sacrifice and abandonment. And for Germany, a cautionary monument to brilliance turned to futility, a fleeting victory transformed into enduring misfortune.